I have the privilege of knowing a number of you in the audience, and I guess I'd like to begin by saying there's some great leaders in the room aside from anything I would claim. And I've always felt I've got more to learn than to teach. You'll probably see that this morning, but I am certain that all of you have a lot to teach. And I wish I could take the time to learn from every one of you. I also have a confession that I've always been surprised about how much I didn't know. And one of my great surprises occurred when we launched Bridgespan in early 2000. So I was indeed running Bain & Company, and we'd been studying the nonprofit sector for years. Because I'm really interested in exploring how a big consulting firm might do something important socially other than the ad hoc pro bono project. And we had dozens of PowerPoint slides, probably hundreds of PowerPoint slides. And I had talked to all these people, and we had charts and things, and I was pretty sure we knew what we were doing. And Jeff Braddock, my co-founder, and Paul Carter had also participated, and we thought, we've got this down. And then we launched Bridgespan. And it was as if, my 12-year-old asks me this, Dad, are you taking stupid pills? It was as if I'd taken a double dose of stupid pills. All of a sudden, there are all these things that I thought I knew about the nonprofit sector that I actually didn't know. And there was new language, convenings. Now, I'd never heard of a convening before. And I found out, you can be convened, there's all various forms of this. And I thought, my God, what exactly is that? But it turns out the differences between business and the nonprofit sector weren't just about language. There are actually some really fundamental differences. And my first big aha about 2 years into Bridgespan was, you know what, Tom? It is harder to run a similar-sized nonprofit than it is to run that same-size business. It's just harder. Now, believe me, this was not a revelation that I came to easily. It can't be. It can't be harder. It's got to be easier. It's not. And the subsequent years, and it's now been 6 years, have only reinforced that idea, that in fact it's harder. Now, does that mean business and nonprofits are fundamentally different? Yes and no. There are three structural ways, or three elements, if you will, that are similar to both. All three elements required if you're going to deliver results, whether those results are changing the lives of disadvantaged youth or whether it's increasing your earnings. There are three things that really matter, and they are strategy and capital and leadership. Okay? You want to bake a results cake, you need those three ingredients. Pretty simple. That's true of business and that's true of nonprofits. But let me unpack that a little bit. Strategy in the business world is all about competitive strategy. It's about winning. And it's about financial strategy that helps you win. Strategy in the nonprofit world is much more nuanced. We all know that. It's not to be confused with mission. It's, in fact, about intended impact. What are we holding ourselves accountable for socially? What are we trying to change? And how do we think the world works such that we're going to actually be able to change that? It's actually more complex. And I've been asked, what portion of Bain & Company's, if you will, approach or toolkit has transferred over into Bridgespan? Because Bridgespan's entirely separate. It's a nonprofit organization. Most of our people have a certain amount of nonprofit experience as well as business backgrounds. I think about 60%. I think about 60% of how Bain solves problems and thinks about things transferred over, but 40% is different. And prior to 2000, I would have said 90%. And probably 5 years from now, the 60 will go to 40. I don't know. But the trend is clearly in that direction. It's more nuanced. Strategy is more complex. Change is more complex. So that's the first element, strategy. The second element is capital. Business has really sophisticated capital markets. Capital flows to those organizations that are performing and that have the potential for future performance. We all know that doesn't exactly happen in the nonprofit sector, right? Those organizations that are producing the better results don't automatically wake up and have people pounding on their door to give them money. Any of you experienced that lately? Just pounding, saying, we want to give you money. No, of course not. There are no real capital markets. Capital flows, but it flows for all sorts of bizarre reasons, not all of which are rational. And that's a conversation for a different day. But strategy is different. Capital is entirely different. And then there's leadership. And leadership is what I want to talk about today. Most people think about it very long, conclude very quickly that of those three elements, leadership's the most important. Strategy is, in fact, and this is hurtful for me to say because I ran a strategy consulting firm, strategy is least important. If you have great people and reasonable capitalization, enough money, you'll do great things. You'll zigzag your way to a decent strategy over time. But if you don't have great people, if you don't have a strong leadership team that can design that strategy and implement that strategy and deliver those results and raise that money and impress those people and build those relationships, forget it. Leadership matters most. Now, you could fill a library. You could fill 10 libraries with all of the stuff that's been written about leadership. Dribble. Very little of it tells you what to do as a leader Monday morning. It'll tell you how to theorize, but actually doesn't tell you what to do. It doesn't tell you how to make the subtle trade-offs. It doesn't tell you how to motivate. And what I would like to do today is talk to you about a few of the elements of leadership, some of the trends around leadership, and try to provide a few simple pointers, some of which may apply. Jim Collins written a great book called Good to Great, and subsequently a monograph called Good to Great in the Social Sectors. Have any of you seen that, by the way? Terrific. I'd encourage you to pick it up. It's available. It's self-published. It's like $9 on Amazon. It's interesting because, and this is a tiny footnote, it took him longer to write Good to Great in the Social Sectors, which is 38 pages, I think, than it took him to write Good to Great. Amazing. And he and I had a conversation before he launched that, and he entirely underestimated the degree of difficulty and the nuance and the difference between business and nonprofits in the social sector. Same phenomena. Good to Great in the Social Sectors is consistent in some ways with Good to Great. It builds on the same principles. And one of those principles, and one of the conclusions he reached in thinking through the application of Good to Great in the nonprofit sector, is that nothing matters more than people. Business people have been saying forever, and you see this in every single annual report, people are our greatest asset. His language is slightly different. It's the right people are our greatest asset. And he used this little metaphor, which those of you that are familiar with the work will recognize, and that is, who's on the bus? Having the right people on the bus in the right seats matters enormously. Nothing matters more when it comes to delivering results. Now, that idea is not a novel idea. Any great chief executive from the business side of things believes the same thing. Meg Whitman, one of the most respected executives in the world, chief executive of eBay, has a little phrase about the right people in the right job at the right time. Now that's interesting because she adds the right time. Think about eBay and the dynamic growth and expansion and zaniness of a technology, internet-based marketplace. Timing matters a lot. She's reorganized and moved people around on average about every 14 months, 14 to 16 months. So she would say you not just need people in the right seats on the bus, you need to keep moving them around that bus. And some people are going to go off the bus and some new people are going to come on the bus. Now this creates a tension, doesn't it? It creates a natural tension when you're trying to build your organization about, do you bring people in from the outside? Do you promote from within? How do you do that? It's harder to bring people from the outside. It's riskier to bring people in from the outside. We're going to touch on this in a little bit later. But if you're going to develop people internally, you better have very strong management development procedures and processes and practices and a culture that allows you to do that. Right people, right job, right time is especially important when organizations are confronting uncertainty. If your organization is growing, if the market's changing, you need to be able to adapt. And adaptation occurs best when you've got the right people and the right jobs at the right time. Now, that means leaders have to invest in this process. This doesn't happen automatically. It's not a natural act. I remember I was at this board meeting of a prominent, let's go an environmental organization, and it was their 20th anniversary, and they'd asked me to talk, and I was chatting with the executive director, who was a zealot with a capital Z on his issues. And he said he had a couple of beers. This was after the talk. He had a couple of beers, and it was breakfast. And I said he was a zealot. Irish guy, Anyway. And he says, I said, what do you dislike most about your job? And this is a prominent gentleman. And he said, I hate administrivia. And I said, well, what do you mean administrivia? What do you mean? He said, all that people stuff, all that management stuff, all those performance reviews and internal things. I want to save the world. I don't want to deal with administrivia. Now, he had a $20 million organization. And believe me, there's a lot of administrivia. He didn't want to do it. And therefore, guess what? Was it getting done really well? No, not exactly. And that's not uncommon, because we enter into these organizations around a passion, around a desire to do things, to serve people, to pursue causes, not to deliver performance reviews. That's not what we're there for. So there is this very interesting and complicated natural tension. But there's no free lunch. You're not going to build strong organizations without investing in strong organizations. It just ain't going to happen. Now, part B. However difficult it is today, it's going to get dramatically harder. So now what I want to do is talk a little bit about some research that Bridgespan and Bridgestar did over the last 18 months that leads us to believe, and quite a few others actually, that we are entering an era of what you might refer to as a leadership deficit. So I'll touch on the research. I'm not going to go into it in great detail. You can track it down. It's very easy through our website. We began observing in Bridgespan's clients and through other organizations like the Boston Foundation that there seems to be a greater and greater need for leaders, whether those are chief operating officers or chief financial officers, and harder to find them. What's happening here? And there were a bunch of great studies, United Way in New York, United Way in New England, Compass Point out in California, lots of, if you will, pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. So we set out 18 months ago to ask what's really happening here. And here's what's going on. On one hand, there is a dramatic reduction in the supply of existing leaders. By leaders here, I'm just talking about the executive directors and their direct reports, so we'll make this simple. Dramatic reduction driven primarily by retirements. It's the kind of aging of the baby boom generation that most of us are all too familiar with. But also people leaving management jobs. I had one ED who, she's just awesome. She was just an inner city, community development, Asian organization, tough place. She's burned out. And I said, what are you going to do? Why do you want to, and she was maybe 49. Why do you want to leave this job? She said, I just can't take it anymore. And the fundraising and the whole thing, I can't take it anymore. I said, what are you going to do? And she looked at me. She said, I'm going to do something easy. I think I'll be a consultant. Which is, in a way true. And so on one hand, you've got a supply reduction that's partly driven by good old demographics and partly driven by people leaving management jobs, people moving into government, people moving into for-profit sector. On the other hand, demand is increasing. Why is demand increasing? Demand's increasing because there are more nonprofit organizations. There are bigger nonprofit organizations. Nonprofit organizations are trying to, quote, go to scale. They're trying to, quote, professionalize, run more like a business. We want to see better financial reports. They want to measure results. Donors are saying, we want you to measure results. That doesn't happen automatically. God doesn't come down and measure results for you. You have to pay to hire people to measure results. Where does that come from? So you can't go buy necessarily with that bookkeeper. You need maybe a chief financial officer. And like my friend running that community-based organization, she's burned out. She was trying to hire a COO. She couldn't find one, but she was trying to hire one. And so you need to build organizations. And of course, government is asking more and more of our sector. If you take a snapshot of the nonprofit sector 10 or 15 years ago versus today, it's different, isn't it? There's more attention, it's bigger, more demands, et cetera. So on one hand, you've got supply declining. On the other hand, you've got demand increasing. that would cause a gap. And that gap is actually quite significant. The number of senior leaders, so again, executive directors and their direct reports, that are needed in nonprofit organizations in America, and we excluded, just to make it simple, all higher ed and all healthcare. And we excluded all smaller nonprofits of 250,000 and less. So we're just talking about the remainder, which happens to be core of human services, environment, arts and a lot of stuff we all care about. That cluster of nonprofit organizations in the United States needs 640,000 new senior leaders in the next decade. Now, we didn't believe the numbers at first, and we've kind of modeled this every which way but Sunday. You can't get a number less than about 350,000. And you can very easily get a number up to 1.2 million new leaders. What do we mean new leaders? That means if somebody's a COO of one organization and becomes an executive director of another, that's not a new leader. That's somebody moving in the talent pool within that leadership position. These are fresh people who have to either be promoted from within the sector up into these leadership positions or have to come from outside the sector. That number is escalating. If you looked at that 640,000, where it's going to be this year versus 10 years from now, it's growing, primarily as a function of the growth of the sector and the rate of retirements. So it's hard to predict the timing. It is not hard to predict the direction. Now, this is not a unique phenomenon, this need for management talent or for leadership talent. Business has been talking about the, quote, war for talent for a decade. And you can't hardly pick up a business periodical like the Wall Street Journal for a week without seeing something about investing in recruiting and investing in development and investing in cross-training because they're worried about it. Federal government, the brain drain, an enormous percentage, 60-70% of the senior level management of the federal government is retiring in the next 5 years, or eligible to. So this isn't new to the nonprofit sector. The scale, however, is just as significant as the scale of the teacher shortage and just as significant as the scale of the nursing shortage. The difference is there are no obvious structural ways to fulfill that need. You don't have teachers' colleges. You don't have nursing credential-like programs. So this is a giant leadership deficit. And all that stuff we were talking about the importance of leadership in the context of strategy and capital, is therefore going to be likely become a lot more difficult in the next decade than it has been in the last decade. So what? So now I'm going to proceed with a little bit of so what's. I think there are probably 4 pointers to pass on in terms of how to deal with this. And again, to calibrate it one more time, the number of leaders required in the next decade will be 2.4 times the number of current leaders in those positions. 2.5. I just want to try to get your attention. This is not something we can forget about. If we do, we do it at our own peril. Pointer number 1, you have to invest the time to get the right people in the right jobs. There is no shortcut. So for those of you playing leadership roles in organizations, that has got to be way up toward the top of your agenda rather than at the bottom listed under administrivia. Pointer number 2, the most important element of that is senior recruiting and development. Recruiting from the outside, development from the inside. You know, our observation of nonprofits is we rarely seem to invest enough time in people development. And of course that's sensible. We got to raise money, and there's no money, there's no programs, and we're there to deliver services. And so of course this other stuff would fall to the back. But if it falls to the back quarter after quarter, year after year, you're going to pay the price. It's just a matter of when. So not only do we have to invest them at the right time, we have to have procedures in place to be able to say, we are developing a leadership talent pool, either from within and or outside. If it's outside, you can't delegate senior recruiting. You have to do it yourself. There are too many nuances. There are too many subtleties. Values, culture, judgment, intuition. You can't test those things from reading a resume. You actually have to be intimately involved. And here's a little footnote. At Bain, I learned early on, was actually running one of our offices, that some people had great judgment on recruits and other people didn't. And it didn't necessarily correlate with where they were in the organization, by the way. So you try to figure out who are the people in your organization that are the best recruiters or have the best intuition, the best radar, if you will, for people who will fit. Ought to involve them in the recruiting process. Now, recruiting is not a popularity contest. You're trying to fill a seat on the bus. And we get easily trapped into, gosh, they care so much. Caring is necessary but not sufficient. They have to perform. And that's a complicated equation, isn't it? Now, I'm going to come back to internal development in just a minute. But this notion of future leadership supply is also something you can't take for granted. Over the next decade, as that leadership deficit widens and as business and government have an increasing demand for people, those of you that have really great talent a couple levels down might lose it. Might lose it. And by the way, you guys, we don't have stock options, do we? And we can't offer big bonuses. And a lot of things we can't do. So this notion of bridgers moving from outside the nonprofit sector into the nonprofit sector is interesting, but it goes both ways. So you're going to have to ask, who are my next generation leaders and what can I do to develop them and retain them? Pointer number 3. Probably, I made, there's probably no management mistake I haven't made yet. At least I hope not. And one that I made repeatedly, and it always hurt, was dealing with mistakes too late. Kind of the too little, too late problem. When I was running Bain, we had one of the more senior partners who was running an international office, who I knew was a problem, but he was a rainmaker. He was bringing in all this business. People were unhappy, and they slowly started to leave because the guy was kind of a jerk, to say the least. And, I went the year after, sort of 3 years, and finally it was just too bad, and I had to ask him to leave, which created, huge agony. And the agony, however, would have been lessened had I done it when I knew I had the problem. And we just all deal with mistakes too late. When people are on the wrong seat on the bus, or they shouldn't be on the bus, especially in cultures of caring and consensus and service, we deal with it too late. So for what it's worth, when you see that little yellow light blinking, don't ignore it. Pointer 3. Pointer 4, you've got to, if you're scaling your organization, you've got to build it ahead of its needs. Bridgespan's, I think, gone through 3 generations of financial people already as we've scaled in the last 6 years. And we try to retrain and move people and things like that, but you have to do that because not everybody can scale with the organization. It's the right time issue from Meg Whitman. Now, right people, right job, right time, in the context leadership deficit, is probably 70% of your answer. But there's another couple of chunks that are real important, and I want to talk about each of those. If this first bit is the right people, Jim Collins on the bus, I would refer to that as a who thing. Who do you have in the right jobs? Let's call that a who thing. The second part is they actually have to do stuff. It's not enough just to have them in the job. They actually have to behave in a way consistent with the mission of the organization and your goals. So there's a who thing element, and then there's a do thing. They have to do stuff. The right stuff. So how in the world do we get people to behave in a manner consistent with the leadership, the demands of leadership of the organization? This is one of God's great mysteries. Okay, I wrote a book with Jay Lorsch, a senior professor, brilliant guy. This was his 16th book. It was my first, and by the way, last. The process took 4 years of research and 2 years of writing and many gallons of my blood. It is called Aligning the Stars. It was published by Harvard a couple of years ago. He loved the word aligning, as if, and he's so much smarter than me, as if sort of everything can be perfect like tumblers in a lock. Well, in the 8 years that I ran Bain, Bain was aligned, I think, 3.5 minutes. And it happened on a holiday. Right? This notion of alignment when everybody's doing their own thing and you've got all these constituents, you've got, inside, outside clients, and you've got donors and board members and partners and government and community people and blah, blah, blah. The notion that they're all marching in the same direction, you got to be smoking something. They don't. That said, there are ways to at least get them all headed north or south or whatever, because you get a real problem if somebody's headed north and everybody else is headed south, and that somebody's important. So, how do you get people to do the right thing? Begins with having the right people, Because if you start with people that aren't fully, that aren't with the program, you got a problem to begin with. So that's thing one. But the second one, and as important in a way, is around culture. Define culture. Again, books have been written by culture. I don't think it's that complicated. Culture is, quote, how we do things around here. It's how we do things around here. If we work in a place where we're happy and happy to each other, that's how we do things around here. If we work in a place where we tell people one thing face to face and then we whisper it behind their back, that's how we do things around here. When I ran Bain's San Francisco office, before I did, there was an office head. I was a partner, young partner, and this guy came out from Boston. He's a great guy. I'll call him George. And George was about 9 feet tall. He was colorblind. He wore cufflinks that cost a lot more than my car. And I just thought he was terrific. Well, George liked gum. All right? So I remember I went into the first meeting, and we're having a meeting in his office, big office, and he tosses me a pack Wrigley's gum. He said, have a piece. And he's taking a piece. Well, what would all of us do? We'd grab a piece of gum, right? And we'd start chewing the gum. Well, it turns out every time you met with George, you got gum. And pretty soon there was a bowl of gum at the reception area. And pretty soon you could not have a meeting with anybody, it didn't have to be George, without chewing gum. His entire office of 80 people chewing gum. And there were one or two conscientious objectors that refused to chew gum, but by and large everybody was chewing gum. And all day long of chewing gum, you get sore. So, you'd see the gum would ebb and flow in the morning, there'd be more gum. Midday, people are tired, in the afternoon, start chewing again. And so nobody thought twice about this. So new recruits would come in, and the way we did things around here was chew gum. It's one of the little kind of habits of the culture. We chew gum. People would visit from other offices, especially Europe, and they'd go, what is going on around here? You dress casually and chew gum. We don't get it. So George leaves. George returns to New England. I take over the office. My jaw is now 6 inches, wide. No gum. I stop the gum. Within 2 weeks, gum chewing gone. Gum chewing gone. Boss doesn't chew gum anymore. We're not chewing gum. You don't have to chew gum to get ahead at Bain & Company. Aha. Now, this is kind of silly, right? But it's not silly. Because all of us are culture carriers. We are culture carriers. People look at our behavior to try to figure out what the norms are, what we do. If we wear coats and ties, they wear coats and ties. And the more senior you are, the more people are paying attention to you, the more important your behavior is. The way you move people in the same direction, once you have more or less the right people on the bus, is to very consciously develop a culture that reinforces the habits you want reinforced. If you want a culture that provides feedback honestly and candidly, you say, we're going to reinforce open, honest, direct feedback. Give me feedback. Let me know. You model that every single day. Now, there's nothing more important than being a culture carrier in a manner that aligns an organization. Point number 2, feedback. Prairie Home Companion, Lake Wobegon, all the kids are above average. Did a survey once at Bain & Company that asked, where do you think you rank? And 95% thought they were in the top 5%. And the only thing that mystified me is what the other 5% were thinking. We all think we do pretty well most of the time, and to the extent we screw up, we are almost certain it's somebody else's fault. That's how we get by. Now, there's no way we can improve, any of us can improve, without feedback. That's saying, you know what, actually, you really did mess up, and we care about you, but we'd like you to do better next time, and this is how. Feedback, the most important feedback, is caring, constructive, and negative. Positive feedback, we love positive feedback. We'll take endless amounts of it. We'll interpret it in the way we want to and not change our behavior. Constructive negative feedback, saying, you know what, this is what you're doing, and this is what you need to do differently, and we care about you, want to help you to succeed at this, that's the gift. That's the gift. And we don't do that very well in organizations. Chances are you don't do it very well in your organizations. It comes in 2 forms. It comes in formal, kind of year-end performance review form, and it comes in day-to-day, informal feedback. Hugely important. Informal actually more important than formal. When I took over Bain & Company, we had an executive committee. And part of our new governance structure was that the executive committee at the end of the year would go interview partners and kind of provide feedback. And I was really bullish on this. I said, I'd like you guys to go out and interview 30 or 40 partners and really give me feedback. I was feeling pretty good about myself. Well, unfortunately, they took me up on that. And they did go out and interview, and when you interview people and you ask, okay, of all the things Tierney's doing, what do you dislike the most? And you ask that for 40 people and you write it down, you get a very interesting document. And so they called me into, I remember they called me in, they had this 9-page typed thing. And the first sentences, you can tell it's made an impression. The first sentences were something like, the partners really appreciate your service. The next sentence was the next paragraph, and actually the next 9 pages were areas to improve. And I thought I was going to implode. And I listened, and then they decided that in case I couldn't read, they'd read it to me. So they read it to me. So this was the fire hose right here. So I couldn't talk. I said, I'm not going to talk. And the pain was, we were in a turnaround mode, so things were tough, but I thought I'd had a pretty good first year. I went home to my wife, Karen, who grew up in a town of 1,800 in the Appalachian Mountains and takes no kind of garbage. She's what she is. And I said, I was so fried. I said, I poured myself a scotch. It was a Friday night. I said, please read this. I'd like your reflections on it. So I go have my scotch, sit outside, I come back in, pour myself a second scotch. She comes down having read the thing. And I said, what do you think? She said, it's right. So that was formal and informal feedback. Now, with hindsight, like 15 years, that was really useful. Now, seriously, it was really useful. We can't improve without that sort of feedback. And if you aren't receiving that sort of feedback, you won't improve, formal or informal. If you aren't making certain the people in your organization receive that sort of feedback, formal and informal, they won't improve. They will not improve. They will rationalize their behavior day in and day out. Lake Wobegon, they won't improve. So second point is feedback. The third point on getting people to move in the same direction, I'll call leadership without control. And this is something that came out of the research that Jay Lorsch and I did, but it's pretty obvious. There's this phrase in business called span of control, this concept which is you're in a box, an organizational chart, and you got lines out from under you, and you can control 6 people. You can't control 6 people. You can't control 1 person. Most of us can't control ourselves. This notion that you can actually control people, this is an absurd, this is back there from the, World War II industrial complex stuff. It's still being taught. No such thing as span of control. There's a span of influence. You can influence people. And those people don't always show up on an organization chart, do they? You can influence donors. You can influence board members. You can influence colleagues. You can influence people who are higher than you in an organization. Think about not a span of control, but a 360-degree span of influence. If you are going to get your organization aligned, if you're going to get the behavior doing the right thing, you have to influence the right people in the right way. You have to ask who those people are and what can I do to influence them. And again, topic for a different conversation, but really important concept when you're thinking about your organization. Who are the players that need to be, quote, aligned? They aren't necessarily in the box in the organizational chart with a solid line reporting directly to you. We've talked about a who thing. We've talked about a do thing. I'm going to wrap up on one other dimension that we'll give short shrift to today, but it's hugely important. When you travel in an airplane, and they always say the same thing. They said if there's turbulence and blah, 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 and a mask pops down, you put your mask on first and then help the person beside you. You put your mask on first. Now, if those of us that have kids, the notion of doing that doesn't sound right, does it? But it is right. Because if you're not breathing, the other people are in trouble. Most of us, most of the time, most days, do not put our masks on first. We are committed to a cause. We're committed to an organization. We're working hard. We're not taking care of ourselves. If you are not taking care of yourself, there is no ever-loving way you're going to build your organization. It's just not going to happen. You're not going to be able to put other people's masks on. You're not going to be able to guide them. You're not going to be able to, quote, align them. You're not going to have the courage and the ability to put the right people in the right jobs at the right time. So that requires daily recovery. It requires what John Gardner had called in his writings, Phenomenal Man, repotting or renewal. You have to take that seriously. So let me wrap up by reminding us results, strategy, capital, leadership. Leadership's most important, and leadership's toughest, by far. And it's going to get a lot tougher because of this leadership deficit. Leaders, the great leaders, are institution builders. They're thinking about creating something, an organization that is around beyond their own tenure, beyond their own personal horizon. I don't mean institution builder bricks and mortar. I mean institution builder, an organization that can serve going forward. And the attitude is, it's not about me. It's about the institution and the people it's trying to serve. And you know, if I contrasted business with nonprofits, what's interesting in a way is that I think this kind of leadership matters a lot more in our sector. A lot more. This institution building leadership. Why is that? In the for-profit world, as long as there's money to be made, if a company fails, another one's going to come in. You know, a lot of our airlines are in Chapter 11. If some of them fail, there will be other airlines. There'll be other models. They'll come in. Money to be made, there's always a plan B. Always. You know, in our world, in the nonprofit world, because money isn't the motivator, there isn't always a plan B. If your organizations aren't around 10 years from now or 20 years from now, think about the Boston Community Foundation, 90 years. What if it didn't make it past year 10 or 20? What if it's not here 30 years from now? What if your organizations aren't here 30 years from now? No plan B. It's not obvious that other people are going to rush in to provide those services and fill that gap. It's not obvious. And that's scary. And it's scary because of our communities, because the poor, disadvantaged, vulnerable, the folks and the causes we care about. Because if your organizations don't have a plan B, they don't have a plan B. So good luck. Thanks very much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Tom, for that provocative and entertaining talk. In the interest of time, we're not going to take questions directed to Tom now, but he's agreed to participate in the discussion that we're now going to have. It's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of the discussion, who is synonymous with nonprofit leadership in our community. Jackie Jenkins Scott was elected the 13th president of Wheelock College in July of 2004. For the 20 years preceding that, we all knew her as the executive director of the Dimmick Community Health Center, a nationally recognized community health center. Her bio is in your packet. She has been honored. It would take the rest of the time to list the honorary degrees and awards that Jackie has received. I will merely say that we were so pleased a year after she was elected president of Wheelock, she consented to join the board of the Boston Foundation, where, as you would expect, she is making a tremendous impact, though sometimes by asking management painful questions. But that's what she's supposed to do. So my pleasure to introduce Jackie Jenkins Scott.
Thank you, Paul. What a great crowd this morning. It's clear that this topic is important to all of us, and we are so pleased that you're with us. What we'd like to do this morning for the panel and for the rest of the time we have together is to ask our panelists to give a brief 3, 5, perhaps 7-minute case, a presentation of their own organization, followed by a discussion between us and Tom. Thank you, Tom, for joining the panel. And then we'd like to save some time to open this excellent, provocative conversation up to you. And I use the word conversation intentionally because we really want to have a conversation. We all have so much to learn from each other. Tom phrased the leadership issue as the leadership deficit. And I hope that he will allow me to take a little bit of a challenge to that. The Boston Foundation has done tremendous work over many years in framing issues for us. And one of the things the Boston Foundation helped us in the nonprofit sector to do so well is to look at ourselves not from a deficit model, but from an asset model. So I'd like to rephrase this just a tight bit, Tom, to call it the leadership challenge. Because I think when we use terms like deficit, it makes it sound like there's something wrong with us, that somehow we are inherently not good. Now, we know we all have a lot to learn and to grow, but I would argue that the leadership challenge for us is a challenge that is complex and has many facets. And one of those facets is how society views the work that we all do in nonprofits. How are we valued? How are we respected? How do we think, how does society think that what we do is important, and why is it important? So I'd just like to ask us to think about this as a leadership challenge. Now, we have three tremendous leaders with us this morning, diverse leaders from all sides of this complex issue, small organization, large organizations, grassroots organizations, devoted to community empowerment and community control in the truest sense of that word, large organization providing very, very challenging solutions to complex problems within individual families and within the systems that support those families. So we have three wonderful panelists, and I'd like to introduce them in the order that they will speak, and then turn this over to them for the next 15 or so minutes, and then we'll have a conversation. Crystal Cornegy is the Deputy Director of the Urban Edge. Now, you have all of their bios in your packet, so what I decided to do is to not read to you what they've done, because you all can read very well. But I thought I would ask each one of them to say one thing that's not in their bio, to give you a flavor of who they are. And Crystal gave us a very wonderful comment about herself. And she talked about this past 7 years that she's been in Urban Edge and how much she has grown personally as a leader. And she talked a lot about one of the very important jobs that leaders do, because we know leaders sort of frame the issues for our organizations, is to help her distinguish reality from perception. And I thought that in itself was a very perceptive statement. Juan Martinez is the Executive Director of Mass Vote. And what Juan said that he loves most is rebuilding and restructuring organizations. And he's done a phenomenal job of that. The other thing that Juan said he loves is something that all of us in this room who are involved in the nonprofit sectors engage in some way or another, whether we like to think about it in that way, is he loves the politics of leadership, the politics and working in the political sphere. Our last panelist is the wonderful Mary Lou Sudders, who is now President and CEO of the Massachusetts Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. So when I asked Mary Lou this one comment that's not in her bio, she said, "Oh, whatever you want to say, Jackie." So I thought about the very first time I met Mary Lou, and she exhibited another quality of extraordinary leaders. And we know extraordinary leaders have to have courage, and they have to take risk. So I walk in Mary Lou's office, and there's her dog right at the foot of her table, wagging his tail on my leg the entire time we're meeting. And I thought, what kind of leader is this? But what that said was that she was a leader who wore her values on her sleeve. And having her dog with her, because there were some issues, but then I learned that the dog was with her quite frequently, was very important, and she had a lot of courage. And I would suggest that, or tell you that I think that I haven't gone into another office of a commissioner of mental health for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that had her dog at the table since going into Mary Lou's office for several times. So we have an extraordinary panel who will talk about their own cases, which are also in your pamphlet, your books, your package, your folders. And I think that as you hear their cases, they will highlight many of the important issues that Tom raised in his presentation, and then we'll come back and have a conversation. So we'll start with Crystal.
Hello? Can people hear? Oh, God.
We can hear you now.
Can you hear me now? Can people hear me? The mic thing freaks me out, so. Is that okay? Great! I can be louder, because I have no problem with that. Okay. I'm Crystal Cornegay from Urban Edge. I've been with the organization 7 years now. I have to say, we were just joking about how those like extraordinary leader monikers just like freak us out, because it's just hard enough to be every day, and so to be defined in that way is flattering, but it is also overwhelming. Urban Edge, as some of you may know, is a community development corporation that focuses on building stable, diverse neighborhoods, communities, particularly in the Jamaica Plain, Roxbury area, Eggleston Square, and Jackson Square. We are an organization, been in existence 32 years. We operate with a $3 million budget, about 80 employees, most of whom work with our property management affiliate. We have several other affiliates that are part of the organization. And we have a leader, our executive director, Mosa Kakobian, has been with the organization well over 30 years. I'm looking at my colleague here, and has been our ED for about 25 years. This time last year, we got a call from a foundation wanting him, that had nominated him to go on and be a fellow as part of their fellowship program. And the first part of that fellowship required him to go off and be on sabbatical. Now, when I started at Urban Edge 7 years ago, I really actually had no idea who Mosik was. I actually am from New York, and so I didn't really actually know a lot about the community development community here. And so he said he was going on a 3-week vacation in September. And I thought that was kind of cool, but it was such a reverberation through the community that Mosik would be gone. Like, this apparently was the first vacation he'd been on in like 5 years. And so the idea that he would go on sabbatical and actually have no contact with our organization was just, people were just like, oh, he's never going to do that, right? And so, like, how are you guys going to survive? What are you going to do? Because Mosik is always there, all the time. And we have an organization like probably many of you that is built around that one leader, very visionary, wildly successful, and we all operate in that way. So when there's a problem, you call Mosik. If there's a problem with a deal, you call him, because after all, he's done them all, and and he remembers things that you wouldn't know. But he actually decided it was a really important thing for him to do, and decided to give the confidence to us as a staff to say, you all don't really need me here all the time, and you all, as much as I need to not be here, you all need to start to realize that you do more of this than you think you do. And so it became an important thing for us to do, and a really important thing for us to think about leadership transition and what it was that we were going to transition into. Because I think a lot of the community development corporations have that similar model. Like there's this one very visionary kind of leader who, just pushes on through adversity. We also have the system where it's hard to put together things and put these projects together and have all this adversity. And so he thought that we should, and we all did think that we should start thinking about how we transition that. And he started to think about, let's have an interim sort of executive team. And he went around and talked to people in the staff, and they said, no, we need an interim executive director, and it should be Crystal. And so that was actually very powerful for me because I actually never thought about it, right? Like I just never thought about it being me. But it was also very powerful because all of my colleagues said that not only is it going to be you, but inherent in that statement is we're all committed to your success. And so there was it made the whole thing a lot easier because everybody went off and did their thing, and it became clearer to me that leadership isn't about having to do everything. It is about the right people in the right job at the right time. And while that has always been sort of something that I knew, it really resonated with me because, we are organizations of people that serve people, and it's all about the people. And what is becoming clearer to me over time is that what a sort of leader, a management team does is to create a bunch of folks in the organization who have the culture of the organization and the ability to do the work so that you have the ability to support them as the leader, right? And you can go off and sell the mission and sell the vision, but there's work to be done every day, and there are people who are serving people. And how you empower them and how you help them grow and how you say to them, that was really great. You do a lot of really great things, but you're not perfect. And guess what? Nobody is. And so here are ways that we're going to help each other. And, it just really does help build the organization and prepare itself to be around longer than Mosik or me and anybody else, any one person. So we started to think about how you transition not from one person to the next, but from one person to a team. Because when you operate in that way for so long, where everybody's used to going to one person for the answer, it's hard to think that there are team decisions. Like, what's a team decision, right? Like how do we all decide, what pens to use? Like, how do you do that, right? How do we all decide what vision to use? How do we incorporate the voice of our board? How do we incorporate the voice of our constituency? How do we actually do that? And it is really, really, really difficult. And because it's always easier to have somebody else decide. It isn't just that, he's done that so long. It's just always easier because he gets to decide those things that you don't like. The easy things we can go off and decide, right? Like, who calls your boss? Do you call your boss to decide the easy thing or the thing you don't really want to decide? And so if you transfer that to a team, how does that work? How does that really, really work? And how do you really, really empower people to do that? And the other challenge that we're having in that transition is that we are transitioning to this model while this long-term, wildly successful leader is still there and has no intention of leaving. And so, it's not that we want him to. Some days we actually do, but overall, we're very pleased with him. But he certainly has areas for improvement too. But how do you do that in a way? Because, we're all in transition. Then he has to transition. We have to transition. The folks under us transition. Everybody's transitioning into something, and it's not really clear what that is. And so how do you manage that in a time of uncertainty when you have all this external uncertainty too, right? The resource environment is shrinking. There's all this other kinds of competition, and, that everything is changing, and internally things are changing too. And so how do you make people feel secure without losing the talent and people feeling like I'm just going to go get a different job where things are much more known, or I imagine that they are. There's the perception that they are. In our organization, we are very, we can be very open about things, right? And Jackie says I'm talking too much, and so I'm going to be quiet now. And we can talk about all this kind of stuff later. Thank you, Jackie. Oh, good. That's why I didn't want to go first.
Well, thank you, first of all, for... Hold on a second. I'm notoriously a quiet talker, even though I'm also from New York. I don't sort of exhibit the loudness of most New Yorkers, but unless I'm at a sporting event, that's a little different. But my name is Juan Martinez, as Jackie said. I'm the executive director of Mass Vote. It's a 6-year-old organization, so very, very young in a lot of ways, obviously in terms of its existence, in terms of our continuous growth and refocusing internally especially. We also have a very young staff, which is great in a lot of ways, and in other ways there are the obvious challenges of perhaps you run into things we've never experienced before, what have you, and so you deal with that. But they're all learning experiences, which is a great part about that. And there's also a level of enthusiasm that a younger staff tends to bring to work each day, and some of that is a little bit of fear about the future, but all, I think, healthy to the organization. I've been with Mass Vote for 2 years. As some folks in the room know, since word travels faster than I can usually get around, I'm actually leaving the organization in 2.5 weeks. And I'll sort of talk about that in terms of the larger idea of leadership and supporting leaders and supporting organizations and what have you. But as Jackie mentioned, my brain is sort of wired in an odd way where I actually enjoy going into organizations that perhaps are not in the best situation, and I like rebuilding and restructuring and fixing. And a large part of that actually, I guess the largest part of what I enjoy about that is the ability to match up staff with the right opportunities and the right staff, and whether it's recruiting somebody from the outside or doing an assessment of the staff you have internally and getting a sense of whose skill set is where and what are our needs. First of all, where do we want to be in 3 to 5 years, and how do we get there, and how do we get there with the folks we have on staff, or are there gaps that we need to fill from the outside? I actually really enjoy that, and I really enjoy I say this often, sort of the highlight for me of being in an organization, any organization, is when you find or when you see staff members who didn't think they could do X or Y, who not only do that but go way beyond that. And I've been lucky at Mass Vote, and the organization has been lucky that we have had quite a few staff members who have done exactly that, where perhaps others didn't think they could do a new role they were put into. They've gone above and beyond that. And I think a large part of that is just giving somebody the opportunity and the freedom to really take chances, make a mistake here or there, which is perfectly okay. I mean, it's how we all learn. I've certainly made plenty of those, both at Mass Vote and before that. But I think a large part of that for me also is when I was first given an opportunity when I was working in public broadcasting many years ago, and I was fresh out of college, and probably about a year after I was there, was given the opportunity to really step into senior management at this station. And I think I was probably just the sucker that said yes, and everybody else said, no, I don't want to do that. But it was an organization that was going through severe funding cuts, severe layoffs. We went from a staff of about 70 to about 40 in a few months. But I walked into a situation where I had no idea what I was going to do. Senior manager, what am I supposed to do? What does that mean? How does that work? And how many departments do I have to worry about? What staff? Most of these staff members are twice my age. How's that going to work? Things like that. So, but I made my share of mistakes. But I was fortunate that I had leaders above me who gave me the opportunity to learn from those mistakes and help guide me. Now, as that relates to Mass Vote, you have the case study in your packet, so I wanted to sort of go off script a little bit, if I could, in terms of the challenges. One of the things that when I came into the organization 2 years ago, the board had not been super connected to to use a polite term, to the activities of the organization. Perfect example, my second day on the job, I got a notice from the bank saying your account's overdrawn. Welcome to Mass Vote. The board had no idea of the finance situation, and I obviously didn't have any idea because I'd asked the board, and they said, "Oh, everything's fine," and what have you. So that instantaneously you know what challenges you're facing, and it's one of those situations where, okay, well, how do we figure this out, and what are the next steps? And so one of the things we did right off the bat was to do an internal assessment of the organization. Where were we in terms of fundraising? Where were we in terms of staff development? Where were we in terms of our brand and who we are and how people knew about us? And we had become famous at that point for the redistricting lawsuit in Boston. That after 2001 was a 3-year trial, and we were victorious, and the districts were changed back after they had been set into place and had been disenfranchised quite a few voters in Mattapan and some other communities. So that's how folks knew about us, sort of the lawsuit organization. So everywhere I went, ooh, who are you suing today? And then the flip side of that is, what did that take out of the organization for 3.5 years, where you're focused on a lawsuit? So, an assessment of all of those issues, which we can get into more later. But one of the things we found is that we had staff members who were amazingly talented in certain areas, but were not being used at all in those capacities. So it was a sense of, okay, where are we going? Where are we going as an organization? Where do we want to be? How do we get there? And then how do we plug in the staff we currently have, who had the history of being with the organizations from the beginning, for most of them? And how do we fit them in? How do we really create job descriptions, which didn't exist before I arrived? An organizational chart didn't exist. And how do we put all these pieces together? And it was one of those situations where people rose to the occasion. We had staff members who were doing small projects here and there, but some of them were bored by them because it really wasn't what they wanted to do. Others just sort of plugged through it and didn't really see the larger picture of the organization. So we started from scratch in a lot of ways and said, okay, we're going to work on a strategic plan. We're all going to sit down as a staff, and at that time we were 4 staff members. We're up to about 7 now. Where are we going, and how do we do this? And so from the very beginning, we brought everybody to the table and said, how are we going to go through this process, and including board members. Said, you guys need to be plugged into this as well. So that started sort of getting other staff members really plugged into, this is where this is all leading at the end of the day. This is why my role in this organization is important and how I can take advantage of opportunities. And we told folks right off the bat that, you're going to have this responsibility that really matches your skill set and what you want to do, and it's yours for the taking and yours for the growing. We've had folks move into management positions who were part-time employees doing administrative work in the beginning because they weren't in the right slots. And as soon as they were given the level of responsibility that they were looking for, they just blew us all away with the level of with their expertise and how they really took ownership of things. So I know I'm probably going on too long, so I will I probably leave it there. But I would like to talk at some point today about the idea of getting a sense of the culture of your own organization, which is one of the things we did in the early days as we were looking at this restructuring, and getting a sense of who fits here. Let's be realistic as to who we are as an organization. We're small. We're young as an organization, young as a staff. We have fundraising challenges. We have structural challenges. We have branding challenges. We had to brand ourselves. Period. Much less better than we had been before. So who fits? And because we're so small, does that mean that we need more self-starters and self-managers, or do we need folks who need more guidance? And so we can get into that later. But that was an interesting experiment in terms of trying to figure those pieces out. And we made some mistakes, but I think we ended up getting it right eventually. So.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Mary Lou Sutters, and let me tell you the secret of dogs. The secrets of dogs. 1, the unconditional love. 2, they never talk back. They might bark on occasion, mine don't. And 3, they're always ready to oblige you with one more walk. And one of the things about being a leader is loneliness also comes with being a leader. That you, in an organization, you don't have a peer group. Your board judges you. And so for me, dogs, and a wonderful husband, but you can't always talk to him either. But having a dog is a way of having constant companionship, going for a walk. I can tell her every idea I have, and she always agrees with me, making me look like a brilliant Walter Mitty. That's the secret of dogs. And I sort of forgot that, Jackie, that my dog she's a very friendly dog also. And I only violated a few state regulations by sneaking her into the Department of Mental Health headquarters. Let me tell you a slightly different story. and that is like leadership in transition going into a new organization. My shift was from being a public official, where I was the longest-standing commissioner of mental health in Massachusetts history, which only means that somebody forgot to fire me along the way, because in those days, Republican governors only were lasting 2 years and not 4 years. And to being the head of a very large, old legacy organization with a terrific mission, which has been both exhilarating and terrifying. The fiduciary responsibility is obviously very different. No longer is it the treasurer of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts' name on people's paychecks, on those 800 paychecks every 2 weeks. It's mine. And also things like employee health care coverage and the increases in that every year, and annual cost of living increases for staff are not off-budget lines, but very much part of your operating budget. I was recruited, I think of it now, 3 years ago, as it was more of a seduction, to MSPCC. I knew of the agency, but I didn't know much. I knew almost none of the 800 staff. In fact, I knew one name of someone who worked there, but I didn't know her well. And I knew none of the board members, although many of their names were familiar to me from reading their names in the media. And I am blessed by having a board of directors that's sort of a who's who board, who's also very philanthropic, and they don't want to run the agency, but they do want to set the tone. I can do Bain speak. I can take complex subjects and reduce them to 3 PowerPoints at maximum when I go and visit funders. I went on gut. I went on my instinct, which is often how I have made some of my best decisions in my life, and on occasion some of my worst. I did not do a lot of due diligence, and in hindsight, I think I should have done a little more due diligence. Not that it would have changed my decision, but it would have changed my first 3 to 6 months at the organization. So let me just tell you briefly a little bit about MSPCC. And no, I'm not the animal organization. I'm the kids organization. But it is important to remember that all children's rights around child abuse and neglect emanate from animal litigation and animal rights laws. They predated Kids Agency. In fact, today, we are 128 years old. Tonight, we have our big fundraiser where we hope to bring in about $1 million. And I'm here with you this morning. Thank you. I have a few seats left for anybody who'd like to come. I take all that we do seriously. I try to have a little bit of a sense of humor, because otherwise it's not clear I'd get up in the morning. MSPCC is a 128-year-old legacy organization with a mission, fabulous mission, of protecting and promoting the rights and well-being of children. Prevention of child abuse, that amorphous word prevention, is our middle name and the focus of our interventions. The agency has had many evolutions in its 128 years history, but it's always stayed true to its mission, which is one of the things I love about the organization. But at some point, we aligned ourselves with the Commonwealth's Human Services regions and declared that we were a statewide organization. And in fact, to many of you, and I will say this because I am Lily White, the agency's legacy conjures up Lily White Beacon Hill matrons, where we were for many years. The reality is that today the organization is a $38 million distributed child welfare and mental health agency serving 30,000 kids and families in 20 locations across the Commonwealth. We are not a statewide organization, however, which is difficult for even some of our longtime supporters to grasp. And we are the largest children's mental health outpatient agency in the Commonwealth, which is a shock even to me on bad days. We have approximately 800 staff. 35% reflect the richness, which is diversity of Massachusetts. 30% of our staff are bilingual, speaking more than 22 languages, and our web page, which I'm very proud of, is fully bilingual in Spanish and English. All 300 pages of it that support your web. Of the families we work with, just to give you sort of a sense of MSPCC of today, 83% of the families have incomes of less than $24,000. 74% of the adults are not working, 66% of the primary caregivers are single parents, and 39% of the adults have less than a 12th grade education. 42% of our families are white. Poverty is obviously a significant issue. Our funding is diverse, which we like, and I'm doing everything I can to make it more diverse. In addition to services, we engage actively in public policy. People who know me would say probably my middle name is an advocate. But I walked into an agency where I thought there was a strong, aka stable, management, a coherent organizational structure that needed maybe a little tweaking, An exciting project that needed capitalization. In fact, I was supposed to raise $6 million in the first few months I got there, and thank you, Boston Foundation, you were part of that. And basically an organization that I was told needed to sort of re-shine its star, if you would, sort of shake off its sort of cobwebs. Instead, what I found out, in fact, on the very first day that I was there, this is an honest-to-God true story, that I had 19 direct reports. When I asked to see the org chart, I was asked which one did I want to see. It's true. Cindy Rizzo, if she's here, will remember that lunch when I went out to lunch with her. That the structure had developed based upon personalities, idiosyncratic stuff, history. And within the first few weeks, I'm a social worker by training, but I can read budgets. In the first few weeks, I discovered that the recently passed agency operating budget appeared to be looming at a $2.4 million deficit for the year, and I couldn't figure out where the CEO's helicopter was or whatever I must have purchased for that, which over time and with an entirely new fiscal department came to realize that the agency, in fact, had a long-standing structural deficit, operating deficit, and had relied upon, we are lucky to have an endowment, relied upon endowment finance funding, if you would, to balance it off. And that the management structure created or had reinforced long-standing structural and contextual conflicts that had been long simmering. Child welfare versus mental health, field versus corporate, fiscal versus program, you name it, we did it. And that my predecessor, wonderful person that she was, who had been there for a long time, over the end part of her tenure, had decided to avoid overt conflicts and engaged in what I refer to as moving the deck chair's organizational strategy. The board, wonderful individuals that they are, connect viscerally to our mission. None of them are social workers. None of them are from the human services world, which is fabulous and terrifying because, as Tom so eloquently stated, they are different worlds. We are businesses, however. And so they couldn't quite figure out, well, why couldn't I just deal with it? So let me tell you about right people, right time, and right job. So that's literally what I walked into. The good news today is I would tell you that our strategy is depth, not breadth, which is difficult because particularly in an old organization, if you would, where you become so attached to your programs. And all of them are wonderful programs. But we have, over the past few years, made difficult decisions around perhaps we're not the best organization to provide that service and transitioning services to other organizations, not ending them, but trying to find different partners for those. I do believe in partnership because I'm just inherently a lazy person, as Jackie will tell you. Capitalization is very important. So we're in a 5-year budget process of working our way out of our structural deficit because we have a board that doesn't believe in blood on the tracks, if you know what I mean. I mean, I could literally, it'd be easy for me if I just wanted to cut the bottom line to work our way out of a structural deficit. But just to give you an example, hold your breath, because I'm large, we will take $1.5 million out of our operating budget this year, which will not impact services, which will continue to absorb the health insurance increases for our employees and continue to give a minimal cost of living increase, which is really pathetic in the human services world. And so we have, like I said, a very philanthropic board. And leadership, I would say, and I hope, these are sort of, I'm very direct, which is always stunning to me that I lasted so long as a public official. The leadership, I think what I will do for MSPCC is, when I first went there, I thought, wow, this is the place to be to retire from. But in fact, when you think about right people, right time, and right job, I think what I will do for this phenomenal organization is help align it for the future and probably be there for 5-7 years or so, unless the board decides, we've had enough of you. But I don't think so, because this is the board that I really love working with, and they appreciate what I think have done so far, is to really align them for the future. But that I will be a transitional leader for this fabulous organization. So with that, how's that? Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal, Juan, and Mary Lou. Those were excellent comments. There was a thread that ran through each of your comments that I think Tom started us off with in this issue of the right people on the bus at the right time. And each of you talked about it in terms of your own leadership, your own personal leadership as well. And I wonder if each of you, including Tom, could just make a comment about how you do that, how hard it is to do that. And you as leaders, what goes into your head as you think about this? Because part of it is, it seems to me, coming to some understanding in your own mind about this issue. So why don't we start with Juan and end with Tom, if that's okay.
Well, that's a good question. It's not an easy process. I guess I look at it from two perspectives, one being right place, right time in terms of staff development, and the other being as an individual. In terms of the staff development piece, I mean, what we had to do that. We had to look at our organization from the very basic elements of it. We had to figure out what are the gaps we have, what's the assessment, what are the gaps we have, and how do we figure out who is perfect for these opportunities now as we're growing, and the stage of an organization that the stage the organization was in. Not everybody is suited for basically a startup organization. I mean, at that point when I started, we were 4 years old, so we're still sort of in that startup mentality. Not everybody is suited to that work environment, which is fine, but we have to recognize who is and who isn't, and be honest with them as we either do internal promotions or as we recruit from the outside. Say, this is where we are as an organization. This is what you're going to be facing, at least as much as I can tell you. I mean, who knows what's around the corner, but and you have to be honest with yourself too, as an employee or as a potential employee, as to whether or not you even want to be in that situation. And if you don't, we certainly understand, and it's not no hard feelings, obviously, but you have to be honest with the staff you have and with the recruits about this is where you are as an organization, and honest with yourself too, as in terms of where you are, as opposed to thinking you're over here when in fact you're over here. And then individually or personally, I think I've just, out of having been in many organizations where I've sort of filled the role of the restructuring and the reorganizing, rebuilding, I've learned as I've gone along where my threshold is in terms of when it's no longer the right place or the right time for me. I mean, I've learned to be honest with myself as to what I'm good at and the sort of environment that I excel in, what I don't excel in, or what I perhaps get bored by. I think when things are too good, I get bored for some reason. It's very odd, but so I've always, I guess, seen myself as sort of the transitional leader as well, and that my job has been to take whatever situation I found and then set it up for somebody else to really pick it up and go with it. But that just comes with experience. I think you do it. Sometimes you stay too long. Sometimes you leave too early. But I think unless you actually go through it and learn as you go, there's really no better way of figuring it out.
I think a successful leader is always being challenged, and I think another quality of leadership is also knowing when it's time to leave and helping others know when it's time to leave. Because when I see public officials and people who've been in leadership, not that tenure is bad, don't get me wrong, because I think tenure is very important in organizations, but when individuals who are leaders start making decisions that are, I don't know if I'd call them easy decisions, but are comfortable decisions, as opposed to what are decisions that are in the best for the organization, that is not good leadership. And you see it sometimes with public officials. You see it certainly as people who are heads of organizations. And there's a number of individuals who I have great regard for personally who are clearly biding their time to retirement. That is not leadership in my mind. And the other quality of good leadership is sort of helping individuals either grow up into leadership positions in your organization and having people who could succeed you and not being afraid of that. I worry when somebody says, well, he's a great deputy because I know he never wants my job. But you know what? I want the folks around me who are smarter than I am because they challenge me to be a better leader.
Culture is understanding the culture of your organization is key to understanding who is the right person. I think. And I think that people aren't always honest with themselves about what the culture of their organization is. Most nonprofits would like their organization to be a place that's welcoming for everybody, because we don't want to say to people, this might not be right for you, because we don't really want to say that to ourselves. And having Juan was talking about being honest with himself about being ready or not ready, or what he's good at and not good at. Most people aren't honest with themselves. Most people look at themselves and say, 95% of the people say, I got everything right. The problem really is you. And so how you talk about that is, and understand your organization's needs, and the ability to say to people, you're really great, but you're not really what we need right now.
Einstein has this quote. Well, he gets attributed. I think most of the great quotes came from either Einstein or Yogi Berra. but this one is apparently from Einstein, and it is that questions are more important than answers. And you think about it, that might be right. And in fact, in all these stories, it's really interesting. You guys attacked the tough questions, and you all there were external things causing that to happen. A phone call, and all of a sudden the executive director and founder ends up on a sabbatical, or, you're a day in and there's no money in the bank. And you've got 19 direct reports, and 18 of them are wrong, and so oops. Another approach is to ask the tough question, and make yourself ask the tough question: do we have the right people in the right jobs for what needs to happen over the next year or 2 or 5, whatever it is? And that is the art, I think, in this is not so much figuring out an answer that applies to everybody, because it doesn't, but it's forcing ourselves to confront the tough questions. That's thing one. And at least in my own experience, when I've made mistakes, it's because I've confronted the questions, good news, but alone, bad news. Because when you do it alone, it's so easy to say, I really like Tierney. He's kind of a good guy, and he's, convince yourself that things are okay when they aren't. And so there's something about having companionship in confronting that question, whether it's a board chair or whether it's a colleague inside the organization, or even whether it's, data. A place like Bain was constantly doing upward feedback surveys, and I would find that, people that I thought were doing great jobs, the organization, the office, or whatever, didn't think so. At least it gives you a place to start, because we all get comfortable. We get comfortable with folks we like and care about, and they care about us. The relationship's good, and we hang out with them socially. So, the two things: ask the right questions to get at these issues, and then confront them with help. At least that's been my experience.
Thank you. Jim Collins talks about facing the brutal facts in organizational change and leadership, and each of you have done so in your own way, and we're all blessed to have your leadership. I want to ask a question about the resource issue. Tom alluded to it, and I know all of us in this room are faced with much more need than we have resources for, whether it's the services that are needed by the patients and clients and people that we serve, whether it's what's needed in the city for housing and economic development, or whether it's what's needed for what Tom talked about, having the resources to provide the kind of support and training for your staff and for our staffs, to provide a way up in the organizational structure. And we know we never have enough resources. And we know some of that resource for support is what comes off when we're facing the cuts that we have to make or the challenges we have. Do we provide a program for the community, or do we really figure out a way for staff? So I'd like to ask Mary Lou, because you have dealt with this from two sides of the coin. You've dealt with it from your own perspective running an organization, but for so many years as Commissioner of Mental Health, particularly when we were in a stage in this state where we were making huge cuts, painful cuts. how do you think, or what do you think, what are the things we need to help our leadership do when they're struggling with these issues?
Well, those are when the resource issues are the loneliest days. And I do think that one of the things that Tom just said is really one of the things you have to do when you're a leader. I would always, certainly as commissioner, I would come up with ideas. If we had to make cuts, for example, I would sort of come up with some of the priorities in my own head of things to protect, if you would, and what things would be the first things we would look at. But I would always assemble lots of people to talk to about that. That, you know, I have a perspective, and obviously that's where, you know, I am the queen of veto, I used to say, as Commissioner of Mental Health, and actually as president of MSPCC. I mean, if all else fails, I will make the decision. But to the extent that I could have the conversations around priorities, around resources and allocation, and the painful things around cuts, I always do it as collaboratively as possible, understanding how unbelievably anxiety-provoking that is for some individuals and that they cannot participate in it, which is a different conversation with them for a different time. But that is one of the things I've always done. We have always, both at MSPCC and as commissioner, there are certain things we hold sacred, if you would. So when I was commissioner, as you know, when there were some budget cuts, I would never cut children's services. I don't say that now because I'm the head of MSPCC, but because it was such a small part of the agency's budget, and it was there was just something I would never do. But we did consolidations, as you know, which were very unpopular, particularly with the 9 unions that I was working with in those days. But we'd always look for administrative things first. And at MSPCC, we will never cut our training, our staff training budget, which is minuscule given what the need is. But I just always feel like that's the easy place, you know, where people go to cut. And it's probably the one thing you should never cut. Is that. So we prioritize. It's hard. I share it with everybody. I try to be as transparent as possible, understanding that, you know, I'm always available for someone to take the shot at because you are the boss.
Any of the other panelists want to respond to that issue of resources?
This is one of the things I realized when Mosa was on sabbatical. I tell people the thing I realized the most is how much an ED spends their time thinking about money, and I am a person. I challenge. I want to put the challenge back to Jackie, because Jackie said earlier we shouldn't think of it as the leadership deficit, but we think about resources like we don't have enough. We live in the richest country on the planet. Of course we have enough. The how you allocate that and think about that in terms of all the need and the services is really what the challenge is. But in an organization, of course, when you have to make payroll, and that's a challenge, it's actually really never enough. But how the organization thinks about itself, yes, and how you transfer that responsibility. You know, while you may be the queen of veto, it is everybody's choice as the leadership team, because that is a message that everybody has to deliver. Everybody has to be bought into that, not just the leader, because that's too much for you to bear, and that's where the burnout comes from, right? Like you're like worrying all day long about how people are going to eat next week, and so
sure. It's a huge burden. What I'd like to do now is I want to pose a question that our panelists will answer or give reflections on as our closing. So I'm going to give you all about 20 minutes or 15 minutes to think about it as we open the floor for questions. I'm going to give the question, and then I'm going to call to my friend first. What I'd like the panel to think about, and you in the audience as well, is we're sitting at the Boston Foundation, one of the most influential, as a board member, I would say the most influential philanthropic organization in the city of Boston. We've heard a lot this morning about whatever term you want to use, the leadership deficit, the leadership talent challenge. We know about all the changes going on in the city of Boston. What do you think the Boston Foundation, how should we think about this issue? What kinds of things should we do to aid, to support to address this issue. So that's going to be the last question for the panelists. And if any of you would like to give them some advice on what they might want to say in your questions, you're welcome. So we're going to take the next 15 minutes or so and open the floor for questions. And we're going to start over here with Gordon. Mr. Gordon.
There's been a lot of discussion and mention of staff development. Well, thank you. A lot of discussion of staff development. Small organizations, I think, have a great dependency on their boards. Can there be some comments, perhaps, on board development, board training, and so forth, which I think is critical to many of the organizations that are represented in this room?
Excellent question. Juan would like to start off.
You're absolutely right. I mean, I think there's no way we could be doing a little bit of background first. Over the 2 years, we've sort of discovered. I came in after co-founders who great visionaries, but not good at sort of the paperwork part of the job, keeping records, financials, all that kind of stuff. So over the last 2 years, we've discovered quite a bit of debt the organization had that the board didn't realize and that kind of thing. So we've had to look at the board as another part of our organizational development and say, we walked in, we had 5 board members who weren't really plugged in. We need to expand our board anyway. How do we go about doing that in a way that will allow us to better utilize our board as we grow and we face these challenges? And what we've done is really sort of set the same thing we did internally with staff in terms of who fits in this organization. We did the same thing on the board level. What kind of board members are we looking for, and how will they fit with this organizational culture? And the last couple of months, we've added 5 new board members who have really infused the board with a new sense of energy and focus. And we've been honest with them, just like we are honest with the staff, about the situation the organization's in. And things have gotten much better in terms of digging out of the debt and creating financial structure. But it was a challenge to sort of figure out how do we develop this board and how do we give them a flavor of the culture of the organization. And one of the things we did was have a board staff retreat where we just laid everything out from a staff perspective and from a board perspective for those who'd been there for a while, and get a sense as to where it was we needed to go, how we wanted the board to get involved in that capacity.
You took away one of the things I was going to suggest to the Boston Foundation at the end, which is working with boards. One of the challenges we have, which is a great opportunity, is I have a board of individuals who are, and I say this with all due respect to all of them, who are used to being the conductors and not members of an orchestra. If you know what I mean by that. And so, on the worst days, it feels like I'm herding 27 cats. But the reality is, how do you get 25, 27 very powerful, very smart, very great people to sort of function as a board? And as the CEO, the one who reports to them, it is very difficult for me to help sort of get them to sort of focus on how to really provide the governance for the organization, and not just be, deep pockets philanthropists, if you would. And so I think that is a challenge for CEOs and boards, is around board development in a way that, sort of you can deal with the power issue, because I'm a CEO, if you would, with the board, and really helping boards really execute their role. One of the smartest things I did, which sort of happened serendipitous, was as I was stepping down as being a public official, and I was on no boards because I didn't want the perception of conflict, was I was asked to join the board of the Pine Street Inn, which was fabulous in many ways. It's a great organization. But it was also a way for me to understand what a board was in relation to a CEO. And so in many ways, for me personally, that's a great way of how I work with my own board, is understanding how I relate to Lindia. There's another board member from Pine Street Inn is here. And so any of you who are CEOs, if you're not on a board of someplace, go get on a board and understand how the relationship shifts a lot. But I think there's a lot of work to be done with boards.
Excellent. Does that resonate for you? Because you have served on many boards, and I know closely affiliated with Facing History. Do these comments respond to your question?
I think for the most part, yes. How do you select? How do you determine what the board needs? in terms of coming back to the original presentation of Tom's of strategy, capital, and leadership.
I was going to just add an observation and a conundrum that we're bumping into all the time, and it makes me crazy. Boards, often business people, who understand in their businesses that building leadership capacity is the key to delivering results, and that you can't do that for free. And even if they're downsizing the organization, the last thing they downsize is their leadership team. And they'll do a lot of things, but they won't cut into the core leadership team. Those same people will try to lead organizations from a board to unrealistic levels of overhead, and they think about it as overhead. Now, there is overhead. I mean, you don't want to pay excess rent, but you do want to have the right people in the right jobs. And this issue of having a clear understanding with the board around, if we are going to build an enduring institution that delivers great results, we need to have the right people in the right jobs at the right time, and that's not free. And you need to help. You need to be part of that solution, not part of that problem, because boards seem to be more often the latter than the former. And so that's a specific topic in this context, that just having the conversation and making sure that it is aired so that the boards aren't expecting you to jump 10 feet when they're only paying for the capacity to jump 2 feet. Pretty important.
Great. Paul. Absolutely.
I think that there's some very simple things, Phil, that can help a board function more effectively and that can really bear on issues like recruitment. And that is for the board to have a conversation about what it is most important that the board do. It is a unit of the organization. It must perform certain functions. And a starting point, if you can get a board to really agree on what the most important things are that they must do for this organization. And then second, you can proceed to, well, how equipped are we in light of our current membership to perform those functions? Do we have the collective attributes that we need in order to perform the functions that we've agreed to perform? And that can take some of the tension out of personalities and who's on the bus and who's not, if you can get that sort of agreement about functionality. The other thing that I think is very cleansing and revealing is for a board, just like management performs annual performance evaluations, for the board to do an evaluation of its own performance and to do a confidential survey. We do that now every year at the Boston Foundation, and it is incredibly revealing about how board members feel they are doing and how they feel about the organization. It's really a very simple thing, but there's some incredibly sophisticated organizations that never do that. I'm on the board of, my alma mater, which is supposedly the #1 liberal arts college in America, if you believe the ratings. And until just the other day, figuratively speaking, that board really never had a conversation about what it is most important that we do and what do our collective attributes need to be and how should we use that to drive recruitment. But it's really a very simple thing, and I think it is. It can be revolutionary for a board to have that discussion.
I would just add one other thing. Dick Chait writes a lot about the different functions of boards: fiduciary, strategic, generative. And he argues that you need to have a mix. And I think that is very, very important, because boards have cultures just like the organization has a culture. So I would argue that trying to find that balance, because so often we lapse into being a fiduciary board. And then a fiduciary board doesn't have us thinking generative and thinking about our future, which is really what a board ought to be about, as well as strategy. So I would just throw that into the mix. There was a question over here. Yes. The pretty paisley shirt. You.
Good morning. Thank you. I first wanted to commend the Boston Foundation for bringing us together around this topic and for assembling such a great panel. There were two things about Tom's presentation which I really enjoyed, but two things that really struck me. One was when you said, you talked a lot about the right people, and one was when you mentioned the number of new leaders that would be needed for the field. I was disappointed, however, that in your remarks that you didn't talk at all about racial and ethnic diversity, which I feel is one of the biggest leadership challenges that we face. And there is a group, this is self-promotional here, but there are some of us in the greater Boston area who are very concerned about this, and we're focused on the community development field. We're called the Alliance, Advancing Community Development by Confronting Racism. And we're particularly concerned about having a more diverse leadership in the community development field. So I just wanted to hear your comments.
It's a great point, and it's something, we didn't have the time to go into everything. The issue of diversity is already a problem. It's a problem in most nonprofit organizations. It's a problem at board level. It's a problem at the management level. It's a problem that all of us are working on, some of us more than others, for some time. It is going to get worse. It is going to get worse, and the answer to that is simply because of the overall trends. The answer to that, I think, is redoubling efforts. In other words, I met with an organization last week. These young people want to start a nonprofit to help diverse enlisted people leaving the military to find employment, because it turns out 3 years after leaving the military, the unemployment rate of enlisted people, and particularly diverse enlisted people, is like 3 times bigger than everybody else. Say, I didn't know that. Unbelievable. If that's really true, that's unbelievable. So they're trying to figure out how to address that issue to help ease the transition back from military into civilian life. And there's an illustration of where, boy, if nonprofits could figure out how to tap into some portion of that talent pool, it'd be great opportunities for these trained people who are service oriented, have made huge commitments. But we have to start thinking outside the box. I don't know, it was Peter Drucker or somebody said, when you're confronting new problems, you can't use old solutions. It just won't work. And so I would amplify everything you said. I actually think it's going to get harder, because the war for talent, which will be occurring, to the extent, we've got qualified next generation managers, government's going to be able to offer more security and it's more benefits in some cases, and business is going to be able to offer a lot more money. We're going to be at a disadvantage.
You wanted to?
As someone who's just been through this whole horror scene of replacing a longtime CEO and being in that position now, I think the Boston Foundation's role in helping smaller nonprofits deal with the paralysis that comes to a board when a CEO leaves, and the pressure from funders and others to get a leader, to get the right leader, to get a diverse leader, all of that can lead to imploding the board. I think if the Boston Foundation could do anything, it would be to come into that nonprofit that's been successful but has lost a leader and help them through that transition. It's not an easy process, and sometimes the board just burns out, can't function because of this horrible pressure to get a leader, and it's about getting the right leader at the right time. And if as you say, the leadership pool is going to be challenging, getting that board to be able to recruit someone and not be paralyzed is going to be very important.
Thank you. We're going to take one more question, and then we have to close. Yes.
My name is Charmaine Higgins, and I'm the Deputy Executive Director of Strive, which is a workforce development agency. And my question is to Tom. You mentioned earlier that there has to be a leadership talent pool developed internally. And my question is, so often leaders take the road less traveled. In many instances, they were in the right place at the right time. It was very serendipitous how they got to their positions. So my question is, how do leaders then train their deputy executive directors and those and those on staff to become leaders themselves if they don't even know the roadmap that got them to their positions?
It's a great question. It is a dilemma. You see this in particular, or at least we've seen it in first generation organizations where the zealot, is a zealot. It's the administrivia person, right? I mean, there is no way that person is going to be able to coach a chief operating officer to take on all those responsibilities. The key is, I think, starting to raise the right question, saying, what is my future in this organization? Do you expect me to take on more? May I take on more responsibilities? And once that issue is on the table, then the question becomes how. And the how question might mean you need an external coach or mentor. It might be there's somebody internally that can help. But until you get to the consensus that it's an issue, you'll dance around it, and it'll receive lip service. And so many of these things, this is not rocket science, but what the art is elevating the important at the expense of the less important.
Thank you. We're going to go, leaders also get to give advice. So we're going to ask our panelists each if they had a word of advice for the Boston Foundation, or whatever you want to say. You each have 30 seconds.
Wow, 30 seconds. I would, that's my advice, Paul. Best advice you'll get all day. Actually, my list is long, but I'll focus on one thing. What was really helpful for us as an organization, especially given our youth in terms of being around, was that internal assessment. I think if the foundation can work with organizations of multiple sizes, it's not just for small organizations, but to do a sort of an unbiased internal assessment. Where are we really as an organization? What are our strengths on staff? Where's our brand in terms of what donors think about us? I think it's a hugely helpful exercise, and to really force people to be honest with what they're going through as an organization, because then I think that sets you up for the future and the future success of your organization if you can at least start there. But a lot of organizations sort of miss that part and think they know what they are, but they're not really that way, and then they get in trouble. So that's my advice.
I would say ditto. And the other thing I would say that the Boston Foundation could be very helpful on is helping think about the next level of leaders, which is, when I was reading the papers, coaching. There's a great concept. A staff development, but really the next level. We've done a fair amount at MSPC to identify individuals internally to promote internally, but then really helping them reach that next. How do you make the leap? How do you make the leap either internally in your own organization or to go to another organization? I think that is many organizations in downsizing over the years. You lost a whole level of what people called middle management or supervisors, but helping that group of individuals see themselves as the next generation, I think would be a wonderful thing for the Boston Foundation.
Crystal?
I think the Boston Foundation would do a lot to help organizations. I think most nonprofits do have structural financial problems, and no, I don't think a great big check is the right answer. I do think that organizations need to think about themselves as okay with having endowments, and the system needs to be okay with that, because I think I will speak for community development corporations, a lot of what happens is if you have money, people don't want to give you money. Right? As opposed to in business, right? The more you have, the more people want to give you. When you're a nonprofit, the more you have, the less people want to give you. And helping the system think differently about that, I think, will go a long way to sort of promoting leadership, too, because then leaders have more time to do this other stuff.
Wonderful. And speaking of that, I want to acknowledge and thank so much Gita Pardam for putting this. I'm going to give Tom the last word. Putting this on. She worked very hard to get us all ready for this. Gita has informed me or reminded me to tell you that in your packet is an announcement about 2 workshops that the Boston Foundation is sponsoring with Tom and his colleagues, May 18th and June 6th. So if you would like to continue this discussion, that would be a wonderful opportunity to do that. I'm going to ask Tom to give us a very quick last word, and then I'm going to ask you if you would acknowledge this wonderful panel and our wonderful speakers. So, Tom, you get the last word.
All right. If I were suggesting something to the Boston Foundation, I would go back to the power of asking the right question. And I would suggest that the Boston Foundation over the next 5 to 10 years ask how they, as an institution, can increase the leadership capacity of the nonprofits in this area, not just this generation, but the next generation as well. And I would focus on asking that question. And in particular, I'd focus on non-financial levers. I think the event today is an illustration of that. I think one could imagine all sorts of other things. A structured way to share best practices, educating board chairs as to the importance of leadership capacity building and the implications of leadership capacity building. You can imagine all sorts of things that I think the Boston Foundation is uniquely positioned to do because, frankly, of its stature and its reach and its breadth and its focus. and there aren't many options. There aren't many institutions that can ask that question and address it beyond, incremental financial support. So that's what I would do.
So please thank Paul Grogan and Gita and the Boston Foundation and our wonderful panel.